So far, we've looked at strings and how we can store various data types, such as integers, floats, strings, booleans, and lists, into variables. We've looked at f strings, which come in very handy when uh, we want to display information from variables. We've also looked at conditionals, which are if and else statements, where we can direct Python to execute different things based on a condition. One of the last things we'll look at for Python fundamentals um, is this concept of loops. So we have for loops and we have while loops. So these are two different functions in Python, and we'll look at both of these. So when do we need loops? Let me just create a new section. And first we'll look at for loops, then we'll look at while loops. Okay. So suppose we have a list as follows. In this case, we only have five different variables, right? Five different data points. And suppose we want to print out whatever is in this list called initials. Uh, Remember that a list is a collection of uh, data points. So in this case, we have five different uh, you know data points, which is all stored in this variable called initials. And suppose we want to print out whatever is inside this list. I mean, we can directly see that, we can see all the contents of the list by just looking at it. But suppose the list is very long. Suppose it's, a million entries long. And suppose we want to print out or do some sort of filtering for each one of them. So how would we go about printing everything in this first? A for loop is, why uh, a for loop is used for printing this, especially things in a list. So the syntax for a for loop is, you just write for, and then you create a new variable on the fly. You can call it whatever you want. I can call it I can call it value, right? I can call it whatever. For value in initials. So what we're asking Python to do right now is look at each value in initials and do something with it. We already looked at print statements. So what I'm going to do is just type print, remember f strings, and inside my strings, I'm going to write the value is, and then value, right? If I print this, I get ks false ak 3.0 and ba, right? This is exactly what was in this list. Suppose I only want to print um, the actual initials and I want to leave out, these other data types like false and 3.0. Well, remember we looked at conditionals, right? So if something is true, it would do something, if that statement is true. So instead of printing it by default, I can wrap this whole thing in an if statement. I can say if the value. So what I want to really do is, let me write it in comments first. I only want to print the value if it is an initial. um, also a string, right? Because we know that initials are strings since we, see these quotes around them. So I only want to print the value if it's a string. So what I can easily do is use the type function and say if the type for value equals, remember this is the same as saying is. So if the type, if the value's type is str, remember that strings, Python writes it as str. So if that's the case, then I open a semicolon. Remember to do this always. And then I can print it. So if I do this, I should not be seeing this value of false and this value of 3.0. So you see that using a for loop, I was able to go through the entire list, which we initially created. And using this conditionals, right? Specifically the if statement, I was able to only filter out and print the values that were actually initials and not, some other data point. For example, I can change this to float. So if I change this to float, one of our data points is 3.0 here, which is a float, right? We saw that in the previous videos. So if I print this now, I should only see 3.0 printed out. And I did, right? So what are the alternatives for a for loop? If I don't use a for loop, you can see I only used basically 2 lines of code to print out the full list, right? In this case, my list only had uh, five different values. If I wanted to print them out without using a for loop, I would do something like this. I would write the value is, and the first value is ks. By the way, I don't need f strings for this because I'm not, you know, using any variables. And I would have to do this for each and every value. And that's really what Python is doing in the backend with this for loop. It executes this statement over and over again, but we only have to write it once. So if I remove this condition and I only print out everything in the list, I get this, right? What I can also do is hard code these in, and I would get the same output. You see how the outputs are the same, but the number of lines of code that we used for the first one in using a for loop was much lower. And as we increase the size of our list, right? In this case, we only had 5. But if I increase this to 1,000,000, if I don't use a for loop, I would have to individually write 1,000,000 print statements, right? But in this case, the same code would work if we increased the size of this list called initials. So in the background, you can think of a for loop just doing the same steps over and over again. And it does it until the list is finished. Instead of writing initials, we can also write range. So we can give it a range from 0 to 5. So remember that Python starts with 0, it doesn't start at 1. So this value is the 0th value. This is the first value. This is the second, third, and fourth. So we have basically 4 values here, and 0 is also counted as a value. The reason I'm writing 5 is because the function range doesn't include the last number. So what it's really doing is looking at 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, this is only printing a range, right? So it doesn't, if I print value, it's not going to print out these specific values because I haven't connected it yet to the actual list called initials, right? Instead, I've just said print every number from 0 to 4, and that's what it's doing. What I need to do is use something called indexing. So in that case, what I would do is write initials and then open square brackets. You can do this as well. Try this out. And here I would write value. So now it's checking the 0th value, the 0th index and initials, the first index, second, third, fourth, etc. I can change this to a 1, right? So what do you think it would do now? It's only going to print the 0th and the 0th value because 1 is not included. So it only prints the first one. So that's, how for loops can be useful. Really, they do come in handy when we're trying to work with massive amounts of data. So it's a good prerequisite to know. While loops, on the other hand, are a little different. They execute for infinite time until the condition is not true. So you usually put a condition here, right? While some condition, do something, print I. So, I can do something like while uh, while counter is less than 10, keep printing high, and I create a new variable called counter here, and I initialize it to 0. So the counter's value is right now 0. So 0 is less than 10, so it's going to print high forever. It's never going to stop. So what I have to do inside this while as well is increase the value of counter. So it increases by 1 every time this print statement is executed. So for that, I can just reassign the value. I can say counter is counter plus 1. So the old counter's value was 0. If we add 1 to it, the new value is now 1. And the next time that it does it, the new value was 1. We add 1 to it, the new value is 2. And it's going to keep doing this until the counter is less than 10. So ideally, it should only execute 10 times, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So while loops are a little bit different than for loops, they, execute as long as the condition that you put inside is true. And that covers the fundamentals of Python. We looked at these key 5 areas. What we're going to cover next is handling data using pandas, which is a Python library for data science. And we can do various things with CSV files using pandas.